Welcome back. We're diving deep into Think Again, How to Reason and Argue, a book by Walter Sinnott-Armstrong.
Yeah, a whole book on arguing might sound a little intimidating, maybe even a bit off-putting.
Right, like are we going to be learning how to win shouting matches?
Well, that's the thing. That's not what this book is about at all.
Okay, good. I was a little worried there.
It's actually about something much deeper and arguably more important, especially in today's world.
So what is it about then?
It's about understanding each other, finding common ground, and maybe even, working together to solve problems. Even when, and maybe especially when, we disagree, sometimes passionately.
So it's not about winning arguments. It's about using arguments productively.
Exactly. And the book actually kicks off by tackling this idea of polarization, where people with different viewpoints are becoming more and more isolated.
Yeah, and less willing to even listen to each other, let alone have, reasonable conversations.
Right. It's like we're all retreating into these echo chambers where we only hear what we want to hear.
I've definitely seen this play out in my own life. It's like everyone's just digging in their heels and refusing to budge.
Sinnott-Armstrong actually dives into a ton of research on this, showing just how extreme political views, for example, are becoming.
And how it's leading to this kind of hardening of positions, this unwillingness to compromise or even consider other perspectives.
It's like we're losing the ability to even have those healthy debates, the kind that actually lead to progress and understanding.
And it's not just an American thing, right?
Exactly. It's a global phenomenon.
Oh, wow. So it's like everywhere you look, people are just talking past each other?
The book actually highlights similar trends in Europe, Asia. I mean, you see it all over the globe.
So we're dealing with this kind of widespread breakdown in communication. Then
Sinnott-Armstrong calls it toxic talk, this inability to argue well.
Okay, I like that. Toxic talk.
He says it's poisoning our conversations, everywhere, from politics to online forums.
Even our personal lives.
Exactly. And he uses these really powerful real-world examples to illustrate this.
Like what?
Well, one that really stuck with me was this case of George Yancey. He's a philosophy professor.
Okay, I think I've heard of him.
He wrote this article challenging white Americans to confront their own racism.
And I'm guessing the response was, let's say, less than enthusiastic.
It was brutal. People resorted to personal attacks, even threats, instead of actually engaging with his arguments.
It's like they just wanted to shut him down, silence him, rather than actually have a conversation.
It was a clear example of how toxic talk just completely shuts down any attempt at a productive conversation.
It really does feel like we've forgotten how to disagree constructively, to have those tough conversations without resorting to personal attacks or just shutting down completely.
That's exactly what Sinnott-Armstrong is getting at. He's saying that we need to relearn those skills, the skills of reasoning and arguing effectively.
So where do arguments fit into all of this? I mean, isn't that part of the problem?
Well, that's where it gets interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
He argues that understanding how to reason and argue is actually the key to bridging those divides, to having those difficult conversations without them turning toxic.
So it's not about avoiding arguments altogether. It's about learning how to have them. Well,
right. It's about using arguments as tools for understanding and collaboration, not as weapons.
okay, that makes sense.
But he makes a really important distinction right at the beginning.
I'm all ears.
He says there's a difference between just contradicting someone and actually presenting an argument.
So like if I say, the sky is blue, and you say, no, it's not, that's not an argument.
Right, that's just a contradiction. A real argument involves actually laying out a series of statements, that give a reason for your point of view.
Okay, so it's about more than just stating your opinion. It's about backing it up with, reasons and evidence.
Exactly. He uses a really funny example from Monty Python. That argument clinic skit.
Oh, I love Monty Python. What happens in it?
A customer goes to this clinic expecting a good argument.
Makes sense. That's what the clinic is for, right?
But the arguer he encounters, all he does is throw out these random contradictions like, no, it isn't.
So he's not actually giving any reasons for his disagreement. He's just being contrary.
Exactly. It's a hilarious way of illustrating how simply denying someone's claim, it doesn't actually constitute an argument.
You have to actually offer reasons and evidence to back up your position.
Right. Otherwise, it's just empty rhetoric. And that's a big part of what's fueling this toxic talk we were talking about.
So how do we know if an argument is actually any good? What makes it a strong argument?
That's where the concepts of validity and soundness come in.
Oh, those sound familiar from, philosophy class?
They're essential for evaluating arguments.
Okay, remind me what they mean again.
So an argument is considered valid if the conclusion logically follows from the premises.
So, like, if the starting points are true, the conclusion must also be true.
Exactly. But that doesn't automatically mean the argument is solid. For that, it also needs to be sound.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It means that the premises themselves have to actually be true.
So you could have an argument that's logically valid, but if it's built on false information,
The conclusion won't hold up.
yeah, that makes sense. So we need to look at both the logic of the argument and whether the starting points are actually true.
Exactly.
This brings us to another point the book dives into: fallacies.
Oh, yeah, those are fun.
Remind me what those are again.
They're essentially common errors in reasoning.
The kinds of mistakes we make when we're not thinking critically,
That can make an argument seem persuasive.
even though it's actually flawed.
Exactly. They're like traps we can fall into.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, one very common fallacy is called ad hominem, which means against the person.
Okay, so instead of addressing the argument itself, you attack the person making it.
Right, like saying, you can't trust anything that politician says, they're a known liar.
Even if they might be right about this specific issue.
Exactly. Attacking someone's character doesn't automatically invalidate their argument.
Right, you have to actually address the content of what they're saying.
That's the key, and that's something we see happening all the time, especially in those heated online debates.
Where it's all about scoring points and tearing down the other side instead of actually engaging with their ideas.
And that's exactly the kind of toxic talk that Sinnott-Armstrong is warning us about.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The book goes beyond just identifying these fallacies.
Okay, where does he go from there?
He actually gives us strategies for effectively refuting bad arguments, like how to dismantle them with logic and reason.
So he's not just pointing out the problems, he's actually giving us tools to address them.
Yeah, which is incredibly valuable, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with so much misinformation and bad arguments.
What are some of the techniques he suggests?
Well, he introduces several powerful methods.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
One is using what he calls counterexamples,
Counterexamples. That sounds familiar.
which basically means finding a specific example that contradicts a general claim.
So if someone says all politicians are corrupt,
You could point to examples of politicians who are known for their integrity, people who have a track record of ethical behavior.
so just one counterexample can often dismantle that sweeping generalization.
Exactly. Another technique he talks about is called reductio ad absurdum.
Which means what? I'm not familiar with that term.
It basically means reducing the argument to absurdity.
Okay, I'm still not quite getting it.
So you take their logic and show how it leads to ridiculous or impossible conclusions. Kind of like saying, if your logic is true, then this absurd thing must also be true.
So you're kind of exposing the flaws in their reasoning by taking it to its logical extreme?
Exactly. He gives this great example about the claim that China has the largest number of citizens.
Okay, I see where this is going.
You could point out that if just one more person is born in China,
That previous number is no longer the largest.
right, it highlights the kind of inherent instability or logical inconsistency in that original claim.
That's clever. I like that.
So by kind of exposing those logical flaws, you're essentially dismantling the argument.
Right, and you're doing it in a way that's hard to refute because you're using their own logic against them.
Precisely. And what's even more fascinating is how Sinnott-Armstrong emphasizes the power of what he calls parallel reasoning.
Okay, parallel reasoning. What's that?
It's a really powerful technique.
Tell me more. I'm curious.
It involves finding another argument that has a similar structure.
Okay, so like the same kind of logic.
Right. But the conclusion is obviously false or ridiculous.
So you're showing that if their logic works in one case, it would also lead to this absurd outcome in another case.
Exactly. One of the examples he uses is Martin Luther King Jr.'s response to critics of civil disobedience.
Oh, that's interesting. What did they say?
Well, his critics argued that King's actions were unjustified.
Because they were breaking the law.
Right. And also because they were provoking violence from his opponents.
So they were essentially blaming the victim for the violence?
You could say that, and King brilliantly countered this by drawing a parallel to, a robbery.
A robbery. Okay, how did he do that?
He argued that blaming him for provoking violence is like blaming a robbery victim for carrying money.
Ah, I see. So, the victim's possession of money doesn't justify the robber's actions.
Exactly. It's not the victim's fault that the robber chose to commit a crime.
So King was essentially highlighting the flawed logic of his critic's argument by applying it to this completely different situation.
Where the absurdity of that argument becomes really clear. You wouldn't blame a robbery victim for being robbed, so why blame King for the violence perpetrated against him and his followers?
It forces you to kind of reconsider your reasoning by showing how your logic could lead to these unacceptable conclusions in other contexts.
Wow, this is giving me so much to think about. I'm starting to see how these concepts like validity, soundness, fallacies, these different techniques, they can actually help us have more productive conversations.
Even with people we strongly disagree with. And that's really the heart of what Sinnott-Armstrong is getting at. It's not about winning arguments. It's about using them to bridge divides, to understand each other better.
So it's not about being right. It's about understanding and finding common ground.
And being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
That's a powerful message, especially in today's world, where everyone seems so certain about everything.
It's about recognizing that we all have our own biases and perspectives, and that those can sometimes cloud our judgment.
And that's okay, as long as we're willing to listen to each other and consider other viewpoints.
And to be open to changing our minds when presented with good reasons and evidence.
Right, that's what real intellectual humility looks like.
And that's what can ultimately lead to real progress and understanding.
Yeah, I'm really curious about this, because in real life, arguments aren't always perfectly laid out like we see in textbooks.
Exactly. They're messy, they're embedded in everyday language, and there are all these hidden assumptions and unspoken premises.
So how do we even begin to untangle all of that? How do we spot those arguments in the wild?
Well, Sinnott-Armstrong gives us some really helpful tools for this. He talks about what he calls argument markers.
Argument markers. Okay, what are those?
They're basically words or phrases that signal when someone's introducing a premise or conclusion.
So because or therefore.
Exactly. Those are classic examples. Because often introduces a premise, the reason someone believes something.
Okay, so it's I believe this because of that.
Right. And then therefore signals the conclusion they're drawing from those reasons.
So I believe this because of that, therefore I believe this other thing.
Precisely. It's like a little roadmap for understanding the structure of their argument.
Okay, that's helpful. So if someone says, we should skip the gym today because we already went for a run this morning.
Right, there you go. We already went for a run is their premise.
And skipping the gym is their conclusion.
You got it. He also talks about how evaluative language can be a big clue.
Evaluative language? What's that?
It's language that expresses a judgment or a value.
So good, bad, right, wrong, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And those judgments often signal that there are underlying reasons for that judgment, reasons that might form the basis of an argument.
So if someone says, that new policy is bad because it unfairly targets small businesses.
There you go. You've got an argument.
Built on the idea that unfairly targeting small businesses is a bad thing.
Right. So those evaluative terms can be a real giveaway that there's more to the statement than just an opinion, that there's actually an argument being presented.
Okay, so let's say we've identified an argument using these clues, these argument markers, and evaluative language.
What do we do next?
How do we actually break it down and analyze its structure? See how all the pieces fit together.
Well, Sinnott-Armstrong introduces these different argument structures like linear, joint, and branching.
Okay, can you explain those a little more? I'm not sure I'm following.
Sure. A linear structure is the simplest kind. It's like a chain reaction where one premise leads to another, ultimately building towards the final conclusion.
Kind of like a domino effect.
Exactly. Then there's the joint structure,
where multiple premises work together, like pieces of a puzzle, to support the conclusion.
That's right. So it's not just one thing leading to the next. They all kind of combine to create this whole picture.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. And what about branching?
Branching is where there are multiple independent lines of reasoning, all pointing towards the same conclusion.
So it's like having several separate arguments that converge on the same endpoint.
Exactly. Understanding these different structures gives us a framework for understanding how the different parts of an argument fit together.
It's like having a map to navigate those complex arguments.
It can be really helpful in unpacking those complex arguments we encounter every day.
This is making me realize how much we kind of take for granted in our daily conversations, We're constantly making and responding to arguments without even realizing it.
It's true. We're doing it all the time without necessarily being conscious of the underlying structure or the principles of reasoning that are at play.
Which is why this book is so valuable. It kind of gives us that awareness.
And that awareness can be really empowering because once we're able to recognize and analyze arguments, we're in a much better position to evaluate their strength and spot those fallacies we talked about earlier.
Speaking of fallacies, the book goes beyond just listing those common errors.
Okay, where does he go from there?
Sinnott-Armstrong actually dives into the nuances of language itself.
Interesting. So like how words can be used to mislead or obscure the truth.
Exactly, and he specifically talks about the pitfalls of vagueness and ambiguity.
Oh, those are good ones. They can make arguments really tricky to navigate.
Can you break down those terms for us?
Sure. So vagueness is when a word or phrase is imprecise, leaving room for multiple interpretations.
So like saying you'll be somewhere around noon.
When you really need to specify a more exact time.
Right, that lack of clarity can create confusion.
And it can even lead to like logical inconsistencies in an argument.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about ambiguity?
Ambiguity is when a word or phrase has multiple distinct meanings, and it's not clear which one is intended in a particular argument.
Like that classic example, I saw a man with a telescope. Did you see a man holding a telescope?
Or did you use a telescope to see a man?
Exactly.
Ambiguity can make an argument sound really convincing on the surface, but it can fall apart once you realize that the different meanings are being blurred or conflated.
So it's kind of like a linguistic sleight of hand, making the argument appear stronger than it actually is.
Exactly. So how do we avoid falling into these traps ourselves, both as arguers and as listeners?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah. Well, Sinnott-Armstrong stresses the importance of defining our terms clearly.
Right from the start, making sure we're all on the same page.
Exactly. Otherwise, we might end up talking past each other without even realizing it.
So if we're having a debate about, say, the role of government in society, we need to first define what we mean by government.
So that everyone understands the scope of the discussion.
Right. Are we talking about federal government, state government, local government? What specific powers are we referring to?
Exactly. Otherwise, it's just going to be a bunch of people talking past each other.
Which is what we see happening all the time, unfortunately.
He also gives some really insightful examples of how discounting terms can be used to manipulate arguments.
What are discounting terms?
Mm-hmm.
It's a new one.
They're words like but, although, however, and so on.
So they kind of acknowledge an opposing viewpoint.
But then quickly minimize its significance.
Ah, I see. So it's a way of appearing to address a counterargument while still trying to maintain the strength of your own position.
Right. It can be very subtle, but it can also be very effective.
But it can also be a slippery slope, because sometimes those terms can actually be used to hide weaknesses in an argument.
Or to downplay legitimate concern.
Yeah, exactly. So the key takeaway here is to be aware of how these little linguistic devices can be used.
Both effectively and deceptively.
This is making me realize just how much power language has in shaping our thoughts and beliefs.
It really does.
We have to be so careful not to let words be used against us, to manipulate us into believing things that aren't true or supporting arguments that are flawed.
It all comes down to being a critical thinker, being able to look beneath the surface of language and see those hidden assumptions and those subtle attempts at manipulation.
So if we're going to connect this back to the bigger picture.
Yeah, what's the key takeaway from all of this?
What does this all mean for how we approach those difficult conversations, those disagreements that seem to be tearing us apart?
I think Sinnott-Armstrong's central argument is that understanding how language works and how arguments are structured is absolutely crucial for overcoming that polarization and that toxic talk that we see so much of today.
It makes sense if we can't even agree on what words mean.
Or how to build a logically sound argument.
How can we possibly hope to find common ground on those big, complex issues that divide us?
Exactly. It all starts with recognizing the power of language.
And then learning how to use it effectively and ethically.
It's almost like learning a new language.
The language of clear, critical, and respectful communication.
And that language can be an incredibly powerful tool.
For bridging those divides and building genuine understanding.
Right. It's not about winning or losing. It's about having a real conversation, a conversation that's based on mutual respect and a genuine desire to understand each other's perspectives.
So to wrap up this section, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day, encountering all those arguments and disagreements?
First, be mindful of those different ways arguments can be structured. Look for those hidden assumptions.
And don't forget to pay close attention to the language being used.
Right. Look out for any vagueness, ambiguity, or those sneaky discounting terms.
And finally, remember that arguments should be about seeking truth and understanding.
It's not about winning or losing, but about having a genuine exchange of ideas.
These are incredibly valuable tools for navigating a world that's increasingly filled with misinformation and heated rhetoric. They can help us cut through the noise and have those productive conversations that we all crave deep down,
Absolutely. They can empower us to engage in more meaningful discussions.
even when tackling those challenging and controversial topics that often divide us.
So let's move on to the final part of the book, where Sinnott-Armstrong gets really practical.
Okay, I like practical.
He actually offers some guidance on how to apply these concepts in our everyday lives.
So he's not just talking about theory, he's giving us concrete advice on how to have better arguments.
Exactly. He provides us with what he calls rules to live by for having more effective and respectful conversations.
Even with people we might strongly disagree with,
Exactly. He offers some surprisingly simple
but incredibly powerful guidelines.
that can truly transform the way we approach disagreements.
Guidelines that can help us move from conflict to collaboration. I'm ready to hear what he suggests. Let's dive in. All right, let's get into these rules to live by.
Yeah, these guidelines for better arguments.
You mentioned they're surprisingly simple, but powerful.
He really emphasizes that it's not like these complicated strategies or anything.
Okay, good. I was getting a little intimidated.
One that really resonated with me is be willing to change your mind.
That sounds, I don't know, almost too basic. But I guess it's easy to get stuck in our own ways.
It really is, and it's so easy to just cling to our beliefs and refuse to even consider other viewpoints.
Yeah, I know I've been guilty of that myself.
Yeah.
It can be tough to admit, that we might be wrong.
Sinnott-Armstrong argues that true intellectual humility, it's about being open to that possibility.
So it's not about being indecisive. It's about being intellectually honest.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that we can learn from others.
That's a good one. What's another one of those rules to live by?
Another important one is listen carefully to what others say.
Oh, man, I've been trying to be more mindful of this lately. It's so easy to just, wait for your turn to speak.
Right, instead of actually listening to understand.
Exactly. And Sinnott-Armstrong reminds us that real listening, it means trying to see the world from the other person's perspective.
Even if we ultimately disagree with them.
So it's about empathy, as much as it is about logic.
Exactly. It takes the focus away from winning or losing, and puts it on truly connecting with the other person.
It makes me think about how we often approach arguments as, battles,
Trying to prove our points instead of understanding each other.
which is not really productive at all.
Right, and that's why Sinnott-Armstrong also stresses the importance of asking the right questions.
What does that mean exactly? What are the right questions?
Instead of just asserting our own opinions, we should be genuinely curious about how other people arrived at their conclusions.
So it's not about trying to poke holes in their argument. It's about understanding their thought process.
Exactly.
So asking questions like, what experiences led you to believe that? Or what kind of evidence would change your mind?
Those kinds of questions can help us uncover the reasoning behind their beliefs, and maybe even identify any potential biases or gaps in their thinking.
It's like being an intellectual detective.
Yeah.
Trying to understand the clues that led them to their conclusions.
That's a great analogy. And another one of those rules to live by that stood out to me is focus on the issue, not the person.
Yeah, that reminds me of the ad hominem fallacy we discussed earlier. Attacking the person instead of addressing their argument.
Precisely. Sinnott-Armstrong emphasizes that we need to keep the conversation focused on the arguments themselves, not resorting to personal attacks or insults.
Because again, attacking someone's character doesn't actually address the substance of their argument.
Right, it just shuts down the conversation and creates unnecessary animosity.
Yeah, it derails the whole process of trying to find common ground or learn from each other.
Turns it into a battle.
These rules seem so simple on the surface, yet they can be so difficult to put into practice in the heat of the moment.
Oh, it's true. It takes conscious effort.
And real self-awareness to overcome those ingrained tendencies.
Towards defensiveness, wanting to be right all the time.
Yeah, it's about recognizing those knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah.
And choosing a different path.
A more constructive path.
But the potential rewards of doing so are huge.
I think so.
If we can all strive to follow these rules, imagine how much more civil, productive, and intellectually honest our society could become.
It's an inspiring vision, isn't it? A world where we can disagree without being disagreeable.
A world where arguments are seen as opportunities for growth and understanding, not as weapons of distraction.
Sinnott-Armstrong ends the book on a really hopeful note. He acknowledges the very real challenges we face in a world that's increasingly polarized.
Where misinformation spreads so easily.
But he believes that learning to reason well and argue effectively is a powerful antidote to those problems.
It's about reclaiming the power of dialogue and using it to build bridges instead of walls.
He sees it as the key to bridging divides, finding common ground, and working together to solve those complex problems.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What's the big takeaway from this deep dive into the art of argumentation?
I think the most important message is that arguments aren't inherently bad.
They're not something to be avoided at all cost.
They're tools. And like any tool, they can be used for good or for ill.
It all comes down to how we wield them. Do we use them to tear each other down? Or to build each other up?
Exactly. By understanding the principles of sound reasoning, recognizing those common fallacies, and putting those rules to live by into practice, we can transform arguments from weapons of division into tools for understanding.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm going to be more mindful of my own reasoning and how I engage those inevitable disagreements.
I hope it encourages everyone listening to think again about how they approach disagreements and to see the potential for productive arguments to be a real force for positive change.
It's a powerful reminder that even in a world where conflict seems so intractable, clear thinking, respectful dialogue, and a willingness to listen can still make a world of difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Think Again. We'll see you next time.